So, Jack Ripper, I have came across your type so often in many of these arguments, and from my personal experience, it's like arguing with a brick wall. You're completely void of facts, reason, and logic, and you redefine everything to suit your own agenda. I mean, you're that irrational, you conflate a collectivist system to that of something that's individualist. You go on to say you are a far-right capitalist, the American libertarian kind. Capitalism is far right, I should say, since it gives preference to business management over workers. Yeah, that's right. Completely ignore the fact that these workers apply for the job and have to go through a job interview process, meaning that the employer has the option to either employ you or simply not take you on. But of course, you conflate that with what you call slavery, which just goes to show you the lack of intelligence of people such as yourself. You go on to say, the origin of your philosophy is fascist, written by fascists from Austria. How individualism can be conflated with that of collectivism? That makes no rational sense whatsoever. Fascism, as we know, is all about strong, authoritarian central government. It's a system that is all about strong centralisation. Fascism is all about strong government regulations. In other words, it's all in support of the strong government regulations. This exactly is what defines fascism. It's a combination between the state and of course the corporations who work in partnership that impedes the smaller businesses and gives monopolies to the giant corporations through a partnership between the two of them, using strong government regulation to achieve their end goal. And basically in Nazi Germany, we saw complete state control over the means of production collectively through strong government regulation. That's what Adolf Hitler did, which is truly remarkable considering the fact that you have just come out and conflated Austrian school economists who are, defenders of the free market, how you could conflate that with, of course, fascism. When we talk about capitalism, we're talking about the market that strongly regulates itself. How on earth does that define fascism? How on earth does that define what a fascist is? This just goes to show you the level of your ignorance. Now, it's not even an opinion that capitalism is the opposite of collectivism. That's not an opinion. That is a fact. Collectivism and individualism is what everything boils down to. And when we speak about collectivism, the word collectivism is synonymous to the word socialism. We've got that evidence. When you look at the definition of a synonym, the definition of a synonym means a word or phrase that means exactly or nearly the same as another word or phrase in the same language. For example, shut is a synonym for close. Well, when you look at these 5 different sources with the evidence, you can even go and look this up for yourself. These 5 different sources point to you that the synonym for collectivism is socialism. It's another word for socialism. After all, when you talk about socialism, you're talking about centralism. When you talk about socialised healthcare or socialised agriculture, you're talking about collectivised agriculture or collectivised medicine. That's what socialised means. When something is socialised, it's brought together in a collective group, it's been collectivised. That's why when you talk about socialised healthcare, it means collectivised healthcare, in turn, universal healthcare. But of course, your type love to try and redefine the entire meaning of capitalism to suit your own agenda. So basically what you're trying to say is, you are trying to pull capitalism outside of individualism and you're trying to shove it under collectivism. How on earth can you achieve that in any rational sort of manner? You can't, because it's irrational. You couldn't achieve it. There's nothing rational about that. The word collectivism is synonymous to the word socialism. When you sit there and you call people who support the far right, or shall I say people who support capitalism, when you sit and say that capitalists are fascists, you're basically saying that capitalists are collectivists. After all, fascism is a collectivist system. Collectivism places the state as the central authority over the economy, and the purpose of the people is to serve the government collectively. That is collectivism. Everything went through the state. The state was the central authority. Now, I don't care whether you talk about the theory of collectivism and all your ideas of, collective control in the hands of the people, as if to try and deny the fact that collectivism is still relative to that of state ownership over the means of production or collective control over the means of production. It doesn't change, because the bottom line is, the definition of individualism could not be clearer. As the definition of individualism says, it says, a social theory favouring freedom of action for individuals over collective or state control. Now, anyone with a rational mind can see the problem with your argument here. Why? Because the definition of individualism gives that away. Why is that? Well, let's ask this simple question. What does Nazism and fascism fall under? Does Nazism and fascism fall under individualism, or does it fall under collectivism? That's a simple question. But of course, people like you would attempt to swerve around that simple question. You would not like that question. That question intimidates you. And the simple reason for why that question intimidates you is because it gives you a showing up. The definition of individualism could not be clearer. Again, the definition of individualism is as follows. A social theory favouring freedom of actions for individuals over collective or state control. Are you honestly trying to tell me that is what defined Nazi Germany? Are you honestly trying to tell me that is what defines fascist movements? Are you honestly trying to tell us that it's all about the freedom of individuals from government intervention, from state control? Is that what you're trying to tell me? Because if that's honestly what you're trying to tell me, then you are, well, insane. Because the definition of individualism is very clear. You could not argue with it. But of course, I know from experience arguing with your type is the very type who is backed off into a little corner. So what you do is you basically redefine the entire meaning of everything. Because you're losing an argument. And that's more or less what you're doing now. We have had the argument with socialists. How often have you heard the arguments where socialists come out and say that deregulation caused the banking crisis, or deregulation caused this, and they always say this. Why? Because they know that capitalism is all about the market regulating itself. They know that. That's why they argue in the first place for government controls. It's why they say that oh, if we deregulated such and such, all hell would break loose because capitalism left to itself. Oh, we would all, die, the sky would cave in and all the rest of it. You socialists know deep down that capitalism is about the market regulating itself. How convenient of you to ignore that fact when it suits you. Example, you are ignoring the fact that fascism is all about strong government regulation, and that government regulation is socialist. But I'm not surprised. Basically, you go on to say Mises was chief economist for the Austrian Chamber of Commerce, and was an economic advisor of Engelbert Dollfuss, the Austro-fascist. Dictator Benito Mussolini was no different. Well, it's quite interesting that you would mention the name Benito Mussolini. To quote the hardcore socialist himself, George Bernard Shaw, the founder of the Fabian Society in 1884. George Bernard Shaw, a hardcore socialist, said in his own words, "Socialists should be delighted to find at last a socialist who speaks and thinks as responsible rulers do." Who was George Bernard Shaw referring to? That was George Bernard Shaw referring to the fascist kingpin Benito Mussolini. How convenient of the hardcore socialist George Bernard Shaw to call Benito Mussolini a socialist. And then you go on to say, you believe the free market should dictate the means of production rather than the proletarian democratic society. Wow. I cannot believe just how ignorant this one, little comment here is. Let's touch upon this, because this goes to show you don't even understand what a free market economy is. What you've done here, and this is fantastic. You're world class at this. You pathological liars are professionals at telling lies, and you do it knowing fine well that people are gullible enough to fall for your disgusting lies. And you so long as you keep on telling the lie, people begin to believe your lie. But it doesn't matter how many times you tell the lie is never going to cover up for the truth of what a free market is. And the truth of what a free market is nothing at all like what you define it as. A free market is not some combination between the state and corporations. A free market is driven by consumer demand. And in a free market, there is no such thing as bailouts. In other words, there's no such thing as subsidies. Subsidies themselves is socialist. The only way a transaction can take place in a free market is through the free and voluntary exchange in the marketplace. In other words, in a free market, an exchange will not take place unless both parties agree upon that exchange. Therefore, the coercive use of the income tax rails against this. The very use of government force to force money out of the hands of an individual to redistribute that through subsidies, that is anti-capitalist. Not that you would understand this, of course, but the fact of the matter is, as you say again, you said you believe the free market should dictate the means of production rather than a proletarian democratic society. The reason why this proves you haven't got a clue what a free market is because it is the people of society who dictate production. That's who dictates what gets produced. Now, it's all well in your theoretical fantasy world. Well, I wouldn't really say about this fantasy world. We'll just say your deluded view of the world of what a free market would be, and your deluded mind that is. The way your mind works is this. Let's say we had a free market, and let's say I was a business owner. What you're basically trying to say is, in a free market, I can just produce whatever the hell I like and set whatever price I like, and there's not a single goddamn thing the consumer could do about it. That is your argument. In fact, you would probably stand by that argument. That's your view of what a free market is. And the reason why that argument is completely fallacious is simply because that is nothing like the real world of a free market economy. And the reason why it is nothing like the real world of a free market economy is simply because at the end of the day, you are faced with the reality of fierce competition in the marketplace. You are also faced with the reality that human beings are not robots who zip up the back and have little buttons on the back of them to press to force them to buy your goods. Of course, people such as yourself who have a severe lack of intelligence wouldn't understand this. You fail to comprehend two important factors. Number one, that value is subjective and the needs and wants of consumers varies very differently across the whole of society, and that if you do not provide for your consumers, number two, they can go elsewhere and get it. This is what you ignore. You completely swerve around the fact that the consumer has free choice. In other words, you ignore human nature. You ignore the human being is not a robot you can force to buy your product. And this is the problem because you ignore economic reality. How do we know this? Because in your theoretical, I wouldn't even call it a fantasy world, but in your theoretical view of the free market, you think the business owner holds some sort of monopoly over whatever price they can set, and there's nothing the consumer can do about that. Completely false. Because at the end of the day, let's say you owned a business and you produced goods and you set your price for what you think the product is valued at. Who's to say that the consumer is going to value your product at that price? Who's to say the consumer is going to buy it? There is no guarantee that the consumer is going to spend that money on such a thing. Now, there's a great example. Although we are living in the absence of a free market today, there is a perfect example. There was this new product recently advertised, and it was kind of like a tablet. It's kind of like a cross between the iPad and something very similar to the Kindle. It's kind of like a sketch thing where people can take notes. It looks, I think, is a great idea. However, most of the consumers were coming back in the comments section saying, well, it looks a fantastic idea, but I'm sorry, it looks too expensive, and therefore the consumers were pulling out. The point being is the very fact that this business is not going to be able to hold or sustain that higher cost for long. Simply because if that business wants to at least earn a profit or make money from selling the product, he's eventually going to have to lower his cost to meet that of the consumer's demand. Now, you could say that, well, he can just ignore his consumers, set the price whatever he likes, and the consumer can't do anything about it, but that's not the reality of the real world of the free market, because in the free market, there is fierce competition. Businesses come out of nowhere and provide consumers with alternatives at a cheaper cost, with something that's perhaps even greater than that of what that business provided. So this is the problem with your argument. Your view of a free market is very myopic. Your view of the entire economic world is myopic. Your view of human nature itself is myopic. You have this fixated view that you have created inside your own head. This is the problem with people with this level of mental illness, such as yourself. Your mental illness is that you have created this idea of what you think a free market is in your own head. You've completely ignored the reality of what a free market is. In other words, you are religiously fixated on redefining everything. You're religiously fixated on avoiding the reality of what a free market is. And what economic reality tells us, it tells us that it doesn't matter what you value the product for. It doesn't matter what price you think the product is going to sell at. Because at the end of the day, what you think the price is valued at is worth nothing. You could set a price out there in the market, there is no guarantee it's going to sell. Consumers are not robots. So the economic reality is the very fact that consumers will only spend on something if they value it. In other words, a consumer is really only going to part with their money if they think the value is greater than the cost. What economic reality tells us is what the consumer is willing to pay for it. That is economic reality, and how convenient of you to just swerve past that like it doesn't even exist. Now that's a prime example of what we're up against here. Again, you say you believe the free market should dictate the means of production rather than a proletarian democratic society. Well, that is a free market, my dear friend. That is a free market. A free market is where the democratic people of society individually, freely decide what gets produced and how much gets produced. And here's the reason why. What is the point in a business producing goods that is not going to sell? Now, anyone can tell you that the goal of a private business is to make a profit. Anyone can tell you that. Anyone can tell you this. That is the goal of any private business. If your goal is to make profits, yes, why on earth would you produce goods for your own sake? Why would you produce goods that consumers are not going to buy? Huh? Why would you do that? Why would you, ignore your consumers, produce whatever you freely like just because you think it's just a case, oh well, they hold a monopoly and they'll do whatever the hell they like and they can just ignore the consumers? Why on earth would the producer ignore their consumers, produce whatever the hell they like, throw it out there on the market, and set whatever price they like? The two problems there. Problem number one. Just because you produce a product doesn't mean to say the consumer is going to value that product. What if you mass produce a product and you put it out there on your business shelves and consumers are not buying it? What have you just done? Number one, you've wasted valuable scarce resources. Number two, you've just made a massive loss on your business. Not profits. You've made losses. You made a loss simply because you wasted all that money producing goods which consumers are not buying. So, how can you then ignore consumer demand? You think the real world works where there's no such thing as a marketing research department? Huh? Is this what you honestly believe? Do you honestly think that the world of business works without a marketing research department? Do you even understand the whole purpose behind the market research department? Do you? Do you even understand its purpose? No? You haven't got the intelligence to understand the importance of the marketing research department? The marketing research department, it's their job to look at their competitors, to see what they are doing, to see what they can do to improve the business. Their job is to find out what the consumer wants so that they can get a better understanding of what the consumer is willing to pay in order to get a better understanding of how to improve their service so they can increase their profits. In other words, they increase their profits by having better knowledge of what consumers' needs and wants are. There's no point living in this deluded world that you live in where you seem to think the consumer is just out of the picture, because this is how you've painted the free market. That's basically what you just said there. You just basically said in your own words that the consumer is out of question and that it's just some sort of monopoly where they can produce whatever they like, do whatever the hell they like, and set whatever price they like, even although this isn't the real world of how a free market operates. Hell, we don't even live in a free market today, and we still today see an importance of consumer demand and the marketing research department. Now, I could go on and on and on this entire issue, but this is an example of just how irrational your type are. You then go on to say the merger of state and corporate power is Mussolini fascism. This is what really... my head's about to implode. Are you honestly trying to conflate this with free market capitalism? Do you even know what the meaning of a free market is? The meaning of a free market, by definition, means the freedom of the economy from government intervention. The definition, as I stated earlier, gives this away with the definition of individualism. After all, you cannot put capitalism under another word for socialism called collectivism. So we know for a fact that capitalism is an individualist system. This isn't something you can argue with. It's just a simple fact. And what's the definition of individualism? The definition of individualism is a social theory favouring freedom of action for individuals over collective or state control. Now, how on earth did you draw to this conclusion that fascism, this merger between state and corporate power, how the hell did you draw to this conclusion that this form of collectivism was somehow capitalism, was somehow the free market? What the hell is free market about a government dictating and controlling how much gets produced, what gets produced, the prices, how many people they can employ, the wages they earn, the hours they work, the height they work at, all the safety regulations, and as well, of course, what machinery they can use. I never knew a government dictating and controlling all of that defined individualism, but there you go, that just goes to show you how irrational your type are. You go on to say, under capitalism, there are losers and winners. This is the only accurate thing you have stated. Of course, there are losers and winners. What do you expect? Do you expect to just bail losers out? And this is what contradicts you, because this is exactly what fascism economically is all about. Fascism economically has always been about bailing failure out to continue on subsidising losses. And we've seen this over and over and over. The failure to let failing industry fail, simply constantly bailing failure out, such as the bad banks, instead of letting the bad banks go into liquidation, you kept on bailing them out through quantitative easing. Fantastic. All it led to was what we call legally protected fraud. And this is exactly what corporatism is all about. So yes, capitalism is all about having losers and winners. Of course there is. How else do you think losers are going to learn their lesson? How else do you think losers are going to improve in business? They do not improve in business by having their failure rewarded. In other words, you do not improve by bailing failure out. The only way failure is ever going to improve and learn from their mistakes is by letting failure fail. And the whole positive thing is the fact that they can learn from those who are more experienced and better than themselves. That's the real world that we live in. But unfortunately, we don't live under that system. We live under a system where winners are being punished. In other words, success is being punished and failure is being rewarded. If you want a fine example of failure being rewarded, turn your attention to the coal industry in Great Britain that was running at nearly a £1 billion deficit and was constantly being bailed out and subsidised at the expense of the taxpayer. The taxpayer was paying nearly a £1 billion deficit, basically all in the name of protecting a failing industry. An industry that was long in decline, failing since the 1920s. But you wanted to continue on bailing it out. You wanted to continue on funding this industry despite the fact the market's demand was turning its back on the coal industry. Because newer and cleaner alternative sources of power were coming to fruition. As you go on to say, winners are in the upper class. Winners in the upper class. Now, this is something that's just completely void of reason, because you're conflating today's style of economy with that of a free market. This is just completely false. And then you say losers are in the underclass. Let me just go through the Industrial Revolution figures, just to completely humiliate you. Because I think it's important that we do humiliate you with facts and figures. Because I know that you are a socialist, and well, let's just be honest here. You socialists are completely void of facts, reason, and logic. When we talk about the Industrial Revolution, it's important that we understand that you could not judge things from a snapshot, in other words, a picture, because a picture doesn't tell us anything. A picture only says that, oh, look at the awful conditions, but does that snapshot, does that picture from the 1840s of the Industrial Revolution, does that tell us anything of what the living conditions were like before that period? Does it tell you whether there was progress or not? In other words, do we judge progress by what life was like after the Industrial Revolution, or do we judge progress by looking at what life was like before the Industrial Revolution to what life was like in the 1840s? Well, the truth of the matter is, anyone with common sense could tell you that you measure progress by what life was like before that period. Anybody with common sense could tell you that, but someone such as yourself has no common sense. So anyway, when we talk about that period, when you go back to the 1650s to 1700, between 1650 to 1700, we have a rough, statistical evidence that most historians themselves really cannot argue with. And you could even take that up as an argument yourself as you freely wish. You're more than welcome to. You're more than welcome to even argue with that with many of these economists. But anyway, as statistics show, between 1650 and 1700, building and land ownership was largely what was measured for wealth, right? Building and land ownership. Now, you had three class groups. You had the working class, you had the aristocracy, who were, of course, the small elite, and you had the middle class. The aristocracy in that time period between 1650 and 1700 consisted of 2% of the population, and they held 80% of the wealth. So basically, there was very little left for the middle class and the working class. So what about the working class then, and the middle class? Well, the middle class, they consisted of 8% of the population, and they held 10% of the wealth. So what about the working class? The working class consisted of 90% of the population, but the working class only held 10% of the wealth. So both the middle class and the working class were basically equal in wealth in terms of what they had in that time period. Most of it was owned by the 2%, which is no surprise because it was living under feudalism and theocracy, etc., etc. So we understand that. But here is what completely destroys your argument. Why? Because if we compare that time period to the year 1850, after the first industrial revolution, we can see what destroys your entire argument. And that is the very fact that the aristocracy, now it's important to note the very fact that the aristocracy were richer in 1850 than what they were back between 1650 and 1700, and this is because more came to fruition, more had been innovated, they possessed more, so to speak. However, this is important because we can see from the statistics what I'm about to give you. As I stated, the aristocracy held 80% of the wealth and consisted of 2% of the population. Well, in 1850, the aristocracy, who still consisted of 2% of the population, now only held 30% of the wealth. Why is that? Well, what about the middle class, who consisted of 8% of the population and held 10% of the wealth? Well, the middle class shot up to 58% of the population, and they jumped from 10% wealth up to 50% wealth. And the working class dropped from 90% of the population down to 40% of the population, and of course, they held 20% wealth. So, what the statistical evidence can show us is that the rich grew richer and the poor grew richer. This completely contradicts the entire nonsensical, irrational drivel that you just spouted. And the historical evidence of Sweden proves that, because between 1870 to 1960, under a strong free market, where there was no big extensive welfare state, where in Sweden they had extremely low levels of government regulation, in other words a strongly self-regulating free market economy, with limited government interference and low tax rates, Sweden, with a strong free market, had high levels of equality. Oh, how convenient, another part of history contradicting what you're basically stating. But that's exactly what we're up against. People who, such as yourself, are pathological liars. And that's why I don't really waste my time on people such as yourself. But I decided to respond not to yourself, but to put this information out, to show to other people out there just what we're up against. The sort of pathological liars we're dealing with here. People who are basically completely void of facts, reason and logic. You don't like facts. You basically despise the dictionary, and that goes to say everything about your type of person. But anyway, you say, and thus class division was born, blah blah blah, right? And then you go on to say, the framework of capitalism is very authoritarian in a hierarchical sense. Well, I'm not entirely sure where you seem to get this idea from about authoritarianism, when in a free market economy the individual has the freedom to go and start up their own private business. And I don't know what is what is so authoritarian about someone having the free choice to go and apply to work for another business, the freedom to go and choose who they work for, and even then the business has to go through the job interview process to see whether you fit the job or not. I mean this is what's laughable. How on earth can you conflate that, a job interview process where the company owner, where even the employers are the ones judging whether you fit the bill to work for the company or not? In other words, you having to prove yourself through your own free choice. How the hell is that authoritarian? And this is what we mean, because people such as yourself redefine the entire meaning of slavery, where you've manipulated the meaning of slavery so much that you fit it around individuals having free choice and basically working for a company. That is how irrational your type are. Anyway, you go on to say, this is not to say that a communist state can't be just as hierarchical. What exactly are you talking about? I mean, there is nothing, you couldn't compare anything to that of fascism and communism. It's all out authoritarian. It's basically completely dictatorial through state control and state ownership. It's totalitarian, so to speak. As you say, proletarian democracy is an anarchist society, better yet known as anarcho-syndicalism, would be best alternative to both state-run communism and state capitalism. Well, that's quite interesting, because for someone such as yourself to completely ignore two main problems here. You ignore, number one, the knowledge problem. Number two, the economic calculation problem. Now, the economic calculation problem is something I've addressed before. And briefly, to help you understand why your argument is completely fallacious, it's fallacious because the economic calculation problem is the primary reason socialism in general is a disastrous failure. In other words, it wouldn't matter whether you argue for price controls through government price controls, or whether you argue for a moneyless based economy. Because at the end of the day, if you do not have an economy where prices are freely determined through the laws of supply and demand, in other words through consumer demand, if you do not have an economy with market driven prices set by a free market, if you do not have that, you are going to be living in the absence of, well, the very important information that prices give you. And that's something that you choose to ignore, because your socialism itself never did accept higher prices in the market. We can take, for example, the high prices of housing. You would probably attempt to use a government price control to artificially drive the cost down to set a price ceiling. And even then you may argue for a moneyless based economy. It wouldn't matter what one you argue for, because at the end of the day you are faced with the economic calculation problem, because you are in the absence of the information of profits and losses. The only way that you can get the information of profits and losses is through consumers' own demand, through consumers' own free choice. So, since your idea of this anarcho-syndicalism has no information of profits and losses, how then do you know the information of how much to produce, what to produce more of, what to stop producing, where to allocate valuable scarce resources and where to stop allocating valuable scarce resources, or what to invest more in and what to stop investing in? How do you know that information if you haven't got the information of profits and losses that are determined through market-driven prices? The answer is you don't. You don't hold that information, and that's because you seem to believe that you understand prices better than the market does. And this is exactly the problem. And money, of course, is part of capital. So good luck with all your wonderful socialism when you get rid of capitalism. The word capital, capitalism. It would be absolutely fantastic in your little deluded fantasy world. So fantastic that you would cause a vast waste of valuable scarce resources. You would cause a misallocation of valuable scarce resources. You would overproduce. You would basically lead society into destruction. You would cause shortages, and it's not like we haven't seen that before, have we? Yeah. We've only seen it all over the Soviet Union. We only saw it all over Venezuela. We only saw it all over everywhere socialism has touched. But hell, we'll just ignore that fact. You go on to say, we all know that capitalism could not function without the state. Here we go again. This fallacious argument. The fallacious argument, despite the fact history is completely contradicting you. I mean, as we saw from recorded history, even when we go as far back as the foundation of the first national bank in the United States of America by Alexander Hamilton in 1792, Alexander Hamilton, although he accepted the market's demand for gold and silver, which is fair enough, he basically didn't let the market determine the ratio of the money. Now, in a free market, under capitalism, it's capitalism that basically determines the ratio of the money. It's capitalism that determines basically your interest rates, all done through the laws of supply and demand. But all thanks to your wonderful socialist manipulation of ratio and, of course, interest rates. Now, not in that period with regards to interest rates, but in terms of the ratio. What happened? Well, in 1792, Alexander Hamilton decided to use socialist price fixing of the ratio of gold and silver. As a result of the socialist price fixing, not leaving it down to the free market to determine the ratio, what happened as a result of the socialist price fix of the ratio of gold and silver? It wiped gold out of the market and made silver the dominant standard. In 1816, the First National Bank came to an end. The rise of the Second National Bank came about eventually, and in the year 1834, they tried to do the same thing again. This time, with another socialist ratio price fixing, in order to try and get gold to enter the treasury, it ended up wiping silver out of the market and made gold the dominant standard. This was caused by your socialist controls manipulating the ratio. This has got nothing to do with capitalism, because capitalism would have left the market itself through the laws of supply and demand to determine the ratio of the money through the free market, not through government controls, not through a control of a national bank. How convenient of you to ignore this fact. How convenient of you to ignore the fact that you have a central banking system controlling and manipulating an interest rate. Isn't that convenient? It's convenient because you love to redefine capitalism to suit your own agenda. You don't like the fact that under capitalism, interest rates are determined through the free market, free from any sort of controls. It's determined by the free market through the laws of supply and demand. How the hell can you sit there and call a Federal Reserve using a socialist price control to manipulate interest rates? How the hell can you call that capitalist? But of course, you will try to you will try and argue against that. You will try and, redefine the entire meaning of capitalism. That's exactly what your type are like. It's why I don't even bother my backside with your ignorance. And most of the time, that is. You say because of economic inequality. What, you mean like the economic inequality of that of Sweden, who had high levels of equality prior to the 1960s when it had a strong free market? Exactly. How convenient of you to ignore that fact when it had extremely low levels of government regulation. As well, of course, to conveniently ignore the fact that under a strong free market with extremely low levels of government regulation, Hong Kong, for at least a decade, was closing the wealth gap between the rich and poor. Again, how convenient. You see, you have a lot of poverty which leads to crime. A lot of poverty which leads to crime. Absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. If we were to look back to the year 1950 in Hong Kong. In the year 1950, Hong Kong was extremely impoverished. Now we're talking about poverty that was equivalent to that of Cambodia. Hong Kong was sitting as one of the poorest places on the face of the planet Earth. It was sitting in extreme poverty. We're talking about poverty that was just abysmal. They were living like rats, basically. This was one of the poorest places on the entire planet Earth that had practically no natural resources. And yet, isn't it simply magical that the average household income in Hong Kong went from less than $5,000 per year to now more than $55,000 plus? How convenient of you to ignore that fact. Instead of acknowledging the fact that it brought the masses out of poverty, instead of acknowledging the fact that the average household income is more than $55,000 plus, far greater than what it was in 1950, instead of acknowledging that great improvement, you will pinpoint the current level of poverty, the number of people living in poverty in Hong Kong, because you cannot accept the reality of how many people it brought out of poverty. Now, you've got a very fixated view of poverty in itself. In other words, the way your mindset works is like this. You think that the bottom people living today who are impoverished, living in cages, you think those people are the exact same people as were those in 1950. In other words, you get a fixated view. You ignore the fact that new people enter the market all the time. You ignore the fact that new people come into the country all the time. That's the problem with your argument. You completely ignore all of those people over the decades who moved up the ladder from being extremely impoverished, and you ignore those who moved up the ladder. That's the point. Also note that I have nowhere stated anywhere about perfection, because perfection just doesn't exist. There's no such thing as an economy without rich and poor people, but the fact that you're deluded enough to believe otherwise just says everything. Again, you go on to say, and wars over resources. That what the hell has wars created by government got to do with capitalism? This is what we're talking about. This is where you religiously and ignorantly try to conflate your collectivist socialist system known as imperialism to that of capitalism. You ignore the fact that imperialism places the state as the central authority over the economy and basically dictates and controls. You ignore the definition of individualism. You ignore the fact that capitalism is an individualist system because it doesn't appeal to you. Fact, reason and logic doesn't appeal to you. Of course, it destroys your argument. So basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to conflate that all of these wars that government created, and you're trying to create that with individual liberty. Since when did individual liberty, aka capitalism, aka the free market, lead to wars? I never knew, and again here's the definition of individualism again. Individualism, a social theory favouring freedom of action for individuals over collective or state control. Since when was the freedom of individuals in society in a free market something that led to wars? I never knew that the freedom of individuals from government intervention led to wars. You see, this is exactly what your type do. Your type basically try to redefine everything, manipulate everything that you possibly can to try and blame it on capitalism when it's the fault of socialism with your socialist centralization. And that's exactly what imperialism was all about. So this idea where you try to conflate imperialism with capitalism is erroneous. You then say those wars will be based on profit and the businesses have interest in those resources, in those resource-enriched regions where the military does all the death and destruction. Whatever the hell that's got to do with capitalism, I have no idea. Then you say terrorism is the inevitable byproduct which the state and military use to justify an even bigger presence on the streets in resource-rich regions. That's why you have military occupation in the Middle East. Again, what the hell has that got to do with capitalism and a free market economy? Then you say, since there is no law against too big to fail businesses, what the... And this part is simply magical. This is where you fall flat on your arse. This is the moment here where you basically kick yourself up the arse, if that's even physically possible. You kick yourself right up the backside by saying, since there is no law against too big to fail businesses, the economy went south and forced the government to bail it out to avoid revolution. Here's the reason why this is simply not only completely ignorant. Here's the reason why this is just completely idiotic. Number one, all subsidies are socialist. Now I know that you don't like that, and I know that you're going to feel like you want to cry, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much you want to cry. The free market and capitalism and exchange can only take place in the marketplace if both parties agree upon the exchange. There is no income tax in a free market economy. When the free market was intervened by that of government intervention, we saw things like the income tax. That was socialism being introduced. It's basically through government coercion, forcing money out of an individual's hands to redistribute against the individual's will. Again, capitalism's about the freedom of individuals from government intervention. That's what free market economy is. Now, we know there's never been 100% capitalism. We know there's never been a 100% of a free market. That's why in 1913 the income tax came around in the United States of America, and you even had the protectionist tariffs prior to that period. Now, capitalism is all about free trade. So even the protectionist tariffs was basically against capitalism in many regards. Of that time period, we knew as what we call internal improvements, basically what you call corporate subsidies. Now, it's simply magical for what you basically stated, and here's the reason why. Capitalism is all about leaving businesses to fail to face liquidation, and if they cannot pay for their own losses, they're going to face liquidation. In other words, capitalism is all about punishing failure and rewarding success. Capitalism is not about rewarding failure and punishing success. In other words, capitalism is not about corporate subsidies. Capitalism is not about bailouts. And this is exactly the point, because what you've basically tried to do, you've tried to redefine the entire meaning of capitalism. You've tried to redefine everything that stands for what capitalism's all about, just to suit your own agenda. And the reason why you are religiously fixated on doing this is because you need something to blame capitalism for. Why? Because your socialism wouldn't exist otherwise. In other words, you have to lie to people in order for people to buy into your socialist bullshit. But if you were to ask those same people, and if you were to ask people such as yourself, what's the economic calculation problem? What's the knowledge problem? You don't know, but you expect people to take you seriously. That's the laugh of the century, that is. And then you go on to say the problem with too big to fail corporations is they own too big a chunk of the economy, so when the businesses go under, it takes millions of people and jobs down with it, causing mass panic, not just in the stock market, which can make matters worse, but causes widespread panic in the form of mobilised mass movements and social unrest. See the Great Depression and Occupy Wall Street for reference. No, I really wouldn't need to see the Great Depression of the United States of America to understand this. Why? Because you really did not have a free market in the 1920s. There was a partial free market, but even then, in the year 1922, the Federal Reserve, using open market operations, basically took control of the country's monetary supply. And through the manipulation of interest rates through a socialist price control, and through the manipulation of the reserve ratios through a socialist price control, and basically through the manipulation of a socialist control stripping the gold standard from the currency, you were left with a fiat currency. What on earth did that have to do with capitalism? Now, the reason why this makes you completely ignorant is because free market money is basically money that was determined by the people of society, right? In other words, that free market money was gold and silver. That was free market money. That was our free market money. That was the money that the people of society determined was our money, right? The very fact that a set group of people sitting in a central, keyword there, central banking system basically stripped the free market money from a currency that people did not demand, that in itself is anti-capitalist. But again, how convenient of you to ignore this simple fact. And again, there's nothing free market about a central banking system dictating what your money is. Since when was that free market? There's nothing free market. And that's why your argument is just completely fallacious. You've redefined the entire meaning of capitalism. You've redefined the entire meaning of a free market to suit your own agenda, to conflate it with that of corporatism. And that's why people like you are just so irrational. And instead of accepting and holding your hands up and saying, okay, I'm wrong, you won't do that. You're too prideful to do it. You're too religiously fixated on socialism to do it. So instead what you will do is you will cover it up with more pathological lies. And that's just part and parcel of how you socialists go about things. So anyway, I think I've stated enough. It's been long enough, and yeah. So if you've got any comments, questions, suggestions, post it in the comments section below and I'll be sure to get back to you. Be sure to give the video a thumbs up, and of course, thank you for listening, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.